Hey guys, welcome back to Games of War. Today's episode is video game sequels you've never played. Now I don't mean to insult anyone's intelligence. I'm sure there are some of you out there that have heard of these games and or have played them. But for the most part, in terms of this video specifically, a game was released, it sold well, it was popular, and then some years later a small sequel was released and it went unnoticed. So the point of this video is to shed some light on some of these great sequels. Thanks for tuning in again, and I hope you enjoy. Starting things off, we have Altered Beast on the Sega Genesis. Now this is a port of the arcade game, and chances are if you bought a Genesis between the years of 1989 and 1990, this was the pack-in game you received. So for many people, this was the first exposure to 16-bit gaming. And for me, it left quite an impression. These graphics were state-of-the-art at the time, digitalized speech, awesome transformations. Now it took a little bit of the honeymoon period to be over before I saw that this game was very short, the combat was very shallow, but back in those times it was just the impressiveness of playing an arcade game at home. Has the game held up very well? It's still a lot of fun to play. I really enjoyed the Beast transformations, and overall Altered Beast will always have a place in my heart as being a classic game on the Sega Genesis. Now have you guys played Altered Beast 2? Probably not, because it was never made. But years later, in 2002 on the Game Boy Advance, we did get a sequel called Altered Beast Guardian of the Realms. And there's not too much talk about this game. And I'll admit, when I first saw the announcements for it and read some information about it, I was not very excited. At this time, Sega had already exited the hardware business. They were a third-party developer and publisher, and their track record wasn't really off to like a booming start. So when I saw this game, I was like, oh God, please don't let it be bad. It turns out the game is actually very enjoyable. It's very true to the original. The graphical style looks great on the Game Boy Advance. It looks great on the Game Boy Player on a TV. There's much more transformation going on in this game. I think you have a total of 10, maybe more transformations. All of the monsters look great. The gameplay stays very true to the original arcade. You're still going to be punching and kicking, jumping. The levels themselves are considerably longer, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. Sometimes they go on too long, but I'm never going to complain about content in a game. The graphics look great. There's now power-ups, different things that help you out through the level, like shock waves. You've got shields, invincibility, power-ups that restore your health. Each level has a really cool graphical look to it, and the Beast transformations are awesome as ever, and they actually give you a bit more time to play as the Beast. One of the things in the first game, you got the Beast transformation, then it was almost a boss right away, so you didn't have a lot of time to play as the Beast. Where in this game you have a lot more time. There's 2 attacks, just like in the original. The original digitalized speech is back, the rise from your grave, welcome to your doom. Real nostalgic feelings. I think this game was handled very well on the Game Boy Advance. It's a great sequel to an original classic. If you liked Altered Beast, then you've definitely got to check into the sequel. It's not expensive, it's not rare. Altered Beast Guardian of the Realms is a great sequel on the Game Boy Advance. Next up we have Gunstar Heroes, and this is one of my favorite games on the Genesis. Mind-blowing special effects, great shooting action, a great combo system from Treasure. You can jump, punch, you've got a gun, you can grapple enemies. There's just so much explosive action going on in this game. This is what made me love the Genesis, was the clock speeds, the very little slowdown, all kinds of crazy stuff going on the screen, explosions. This is action gaming on 16-bit done right from the masters of Treasure. I have fond memories of playing this game constantly as a kid, and I really hoped for a sequel back then. Unfortunately, we never got one. It wouldn't be until 2005 that we finally got a sequel on the Game Boy Advance called Gunstar Superheroes. Now, a lot of people call this a sequel, some call it a reimagining because it does use certain characters and bosses over from the first. But however you look at it, we can all agree that this game is truly epic and is very deserving of the Gunstar Heroes name. First of all, the graphics on the Game Boy Advance look amazing, look even better on the Game Boy Player. This game pulls off every trick that the Game Boy Advance could handle. All of the Cyto Mode 7 effects are in full display here. Scaling sprites, rotating sprites. The action is just as intense as on the Genesis, with explosions going off everywhere. The combat has that Treasure feel where you can juggle enemies, keeping them up in the air, jumping, kicking, sliding, shooting. This game has got it all. I was so happy to finally get this game when it came out, and that's the shame about this game, is that it came out, it did not sell very well at all. Nobody even really noticed it came out. Nobody seemed to care. It's only nowadays that it's starting to get some recognition as being a fantastic sequel on the Game Boy Advance. So if you in any way enjoyed the original on the Sega Genesis, which I know there's a lot of you out there, and you haven't played this game, you definitely owe it to yourself to pick up Gunstar Heroes for the Game Boy Advance. It's an amazing sequel slash reimagining. It has the look and feel of the original, and it plays just as well, if not better. Gunstar Hero fans, you must own this game. Alright guys, so next up we have Guardian Heroes. And where do I start with this? The Sega Saturn was my system of choice during the 32-bit era, and it was games like Guardian Heroes and Three Dirty Dwarves and Astall. They were developed by different people, but they all had that certain Sega Saturn 32-bit hand-drawn, hand-animated look to them. And that's something that fascinated me about the console. No other system had 2D that looked like this, and Guardian Heroes was one of my favorite. There can never be enough beat-em-ups in the world. I'm a huge fan of Streets of Rage, Golden Axe, all these great beat-em-ups. And Guardian Heroes was a continuation of that. You had plane switching, 3 different levels to jump in between. You had an awesome treasure-style combat system where you could juggle the enemies. A really big cast of likable characters. Every enemy you defeated you could use in a kind of versus battle arena. And this game had an awesome story, really silly and over the top. Very light RPG elements where you could disperse hit points and such. It was just a classic beat-em-up game, one that I played over and over and over again. Great for multiplayer. And I really wanted, more so than any other game at the time, a sequel to Guardian Heroes on the Saturn, which sadly never came to be. Now I think we're starting to see a pattern here. Once again, many years later, I believe 2005, we did get Advanced Guardian Heroes. And I was ecstatic when I heard about this news. Guardian Heroes on the Game Boy Advance, done by Treasure. What could be better? Truth of the matter is, I was a little bit let down by this game. Strictly in terms of the original was so good that it was a tall order for this to live up to. And it didn't quite measure up to the original, but taken on its own, a new Guardian Heroes game, I'm not going to complain. And it was an enjoyable game. It just wasn't quite in the same league as the first one. And that's okay, because it's more of the game that I love. And it still is a very enjoyable beat 'em up. You just have to play the game the way it wants you to. Now back are a lot of the characters from the original, the Undead Warrior, which was one of my favorite characters from the first game. Back is the capturing enemies and using them in a versus type mode, battle arena mode. And the game looks really good on the Game Boy Advance. It looks really good on the Game Boy player. The controls and beat 'em up action is just as tight as on the Saturn. There's a heavy emphasis in this game on counterattacking. You have to learn the counterattack system, block at just the right time, and launch your counterattack. Some of the levels are broken up by little mini games like time jumps, things of that nature. It's tough to single out what exactly about this game feels off, but it's there. But don't let it discourage you. If you're looking for the sequel to Guardian Heroes, it's right here. Still very enjoyable. The game can be finished in a handful of hours, 5-6 hours, but it is an enjoyable game, and it is a sequel to Guardian Heroes, so for there I gotta give it love. These last 2 games I want to talk about briefly because they're not technically numbered sequels, but they are games in the series. First off, we have Afterburner. Now Afterburner is something I played as a kid constantly in the arcades. The sequel came out on the Genesis. It was a lot of fun. These are like the only kind of jet pilot, fast arcade shooting action. They're not deep, they're not complex, but they're fast, great arcade action at its finest. Lots of intense moments. And Afterburner 3 was kind of disappointing on the Sega CD. It wasn't really an Afterburner game, it just kind of had the name slapped on it. I believe it was a G-Lock game. I didn't feel like much like Afterburner at all. And the game I want to focus on that doesn't get a lot of love at all, is not necessarily a numbered entry in the series, but rather a PSP game. And that is Afterburner Black Falcon. Now this is another one of those games that kind of had me worried. Kind of a no-name developer, kind of came out of nowhere, not a lot of hype, not a lot of exposure. And they changed a few things up. This game has a story mode. You pick a pilot, you can buy new jets and upgrade them. But when I got to the actual gameplay, I was pleasantly surprised. The graphics look great on the PSP. I used the component cables on the 3000, hook it up to the TV, and it looks great on the TV. The action is fast, frantic, it's got a smooth frame rate. The levels are pretty varied. The shooting action is spot on, it's a lot of fun. Everything looks great scrolling by at high speeds. You've got shooting, lock-on, you can upgrade your guns and missiles. And overall, I was pleasantly surprised with Afterburner Black Falcon. If you are into the Afterburner series and you want to play a game in it. Definitely check out the PSP game. It doesn't get a lot of love, it's not talked about a lot, but it definitely deserves its place in the series. Afterburner fans, definitely check out Afterburner Black Falcon. And finally, here we have House of the Dead. Now this is without a doubt my favorite light gun on-rail shooter of all time. This series is fantastic. I love the B-grade cheesy acting, the overall horror theme, and the gun shooting action is spot on. This is the only home port of the original game. This is the Sega Saturn version of House of the Dead. Kind of a rushed port, but it's still a lot of fun to play. I have House of the Dead 2 in the Dreamcast, I've got 3 on the Xbox, and 4 was released on the PlayStation Network. Now you might be thinking to yourself, we got Typing of the Dead, is that what you're talking about? No, it's not Typing of the Dead, but something just as quirky and offbeat. On the Game Boy Advance, once again, this is Pinball of the Dead. And this is a really awesome pinball game based on House of the Dead 2. It's got tables that feature levels from House of the Dead 2. It's got bosses from House of the Dead 2, voices, characters, and overall as a pinball game it's a lot of fun. It works really well in the Game Boy Advance, it looks great on the TV once again with the Game Boy player, and it's just got that House of the Dead vibe running through the whole game. It's spot on, the controls are great, the physics, from what I can tell, I don't play a lot of pinball games, but they work really well in this game. If you're a fan of House of the Dead, then definitely check out Pinball of the Dead. It was a lot of fun, and as pinball games go, it's near the top in my opinion. Great House of the Dead atmosphere, great controls, lots of blood, great bosses from the second one, and it definitely deserves more love. In closing, after talking about these sequels that we did get, I would like to personally say to Sega, let's get some sequels to Shining Force and Phantasy Star, please. A traditional strategy RPG for Shining Force, and another epic science fiction RPG from Phantasy Star. Let's make it happen, Sega, PS4, Xbox One, whatever, make it happen, please. I want to thank you guys for watching, and always remember that Games of War is nothing without you.